Welcome to Stories of Trees. I'm your host, Stacy Whittle. In each episode, we sit down with people who have dedicated their lives to understanding, caring for, and telling the stories of trees. Trees are silent witnesses to our lives, to the people who came before us, and to those who will come after us. They've seen it all, the good, the bad, and everything in between. In this podcast, we talk with the people who help us see trees differently. Scientists, storytellers, community leaders, and caretakers from around the world. We explore why trees matter, how they shape our lives, and how, in ways we're only beginning to understand, how they can help us feel better, live better, and connect more deeply to the world around us. If you've ever wondered what trees might say, you're in the right place. We're so glad you're here. All right, welcome to the Stories of Trees. I'm Stacy Whittle, your host, and today we are joined by Dr. Ray Yeager from the University of Louisville, who is a health geographer. Now, I know many people know what a geographer does, but can you help us understand what a health geographer does?
Hey there, Stacy. Happy to be here today. And yeah, I'm happy to. So, a health geographer, and I understand it's a bit vague, but is a scientist who studies links between place and human health. And that can take a whole lot of forms. A lot of health geographers study environmental issues such as air pollution. They might study the built environment, such as access to healthy goods and services. They might study, access to things that might harm health, like cigarettes or policies over space. It really takes a lot of forms. If you've heard the common saying that your zip code is more important than your genetic code, that's health geography. Why is your zip code more important? And health geographers try to figure out why that is, and especially what we can do about it.
So what do you like most about your job?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think what I really like most is the notion that the research that I do can inform policies to improve the health and well-being of communities around the world. It's just, to me, an awesome privilege and also an awesome responsibility that I can come into work every day and sit down in front of my computer and think to myself, okay, what I'm going to do today is going to affect the lives of untold numbers of people if I do it well.
That's really great because we're doing a series of films called Your Office Outdoors to help younger people understand that there are more jobs than they think there are available in the world. And so someone like you, who probably spends some of your day outside, some of your day inside, is the perfect person to tell the younger generation that there's so much that you can do beyond sitting at a desk. So, I like to ask people also, how do you feel in your job when you mentioned, like, you really love having the privilege of coming in and knowing that your work is impacting humankind. So how do you feel about it? Why do you stay with it? And what would you tell others about the field in general?
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated relationship because a lot of my day-to-day work, isn't that awesome. It's not that much fun. It's not that enjoyable, right? Responding to emails or, working on spreadsheets or doing data analysis, and on and on and on, all these kind of little things that on their own aren't, all that exciting, all that fun. But when you kind of take a step back and you start to see them come together, that's really, really, motivating. That's a really great thing to see. And understanding, keeping that big picture perspective of, the importance of the work and what it can be used for and how it can be used to, bring people together and improve their health and everything. And what you said about young people, I mean, I work with a lot of undergraduates at the University of Louisville, and what I see is very few undergraduates are even considering research as a potential career field, or they're not considering, things like forestry. They're not considering things like sustainability. because it's just not a common job. So what I find myself doing a lot is just, speaking with undergrads and telling them, these are job options. And just because it's not one of the like really common things that you see people going into, for someone who, has this value system, for someone who's willing to work on skill sets, who's willing to stare at those spreadsheets for hours on end and, have an inbox that's never going to be clean, it can be a really rewarding field to go into science and to go into health geography or to go into urban forestry because it allows you to improve the world in ways that a lot of other fields can, and not just improve the world and make people healthier, but make make communities healthier. Yeah. I work with I also work with a lot of people who are interested in research or interested in going into medicine, and that's a common thing to kind of clear up with them is they go into medicine because they want to help people, but with science, with geography, with public health, you can help entire communities. You can help millions of people at once, depending on the field that you're in, and that's sort of a very aha moment for a lot of people interested in medicine.
Yeah, and speaking of helping people, I'd love to know more about the Green Heart project that you're involved in, which I believe is in South Louisville, correct?
Yes, it is. So yeah, Green Heart is a really innovative study in South Louisville. It spans, it touches a number of neighborhoods, but the thing that's unique about Green Heart is that for the first time we have a clinical study with people, in a neighborhood who were enrolled in the clinical study before a neighborhood scale intervention was done. And what we've done is, enroll hundreds of people from across this neighborhood. And then, we've kind of listened to what they want, what their priorities are, their health challenges. And after enrolling them, we went to the neighborhood and we planted thousands and thousands of trees. We planted them in yards, we planted them in parks, in schools, along roadways, you name it. Wherever we could plant, we did. And now we're following the people that were enrolled before the planting to evaluate how the trees affected their health and also evaluate how what we planted and where we planted it might also play a role in that. For example, trees planted along roadways might have greater benefits for health because they reduce a lot of harms like air pollution and noise and heat that are coming from that roadway. Um, and what types of trees, so maybe evergreens are better because they're green and leafy year round, or maybe there's a lot of research out there on trees and health and well-being that just hasn't been done yet. There's just so much that we don't know, and this is one of those ways where we can really try to evaluate whether a neighborhood tree planting and how it's done affect health and why.
That's really interesting. I watched, obviously when I'm researching the people I'm interviewing, I watch hours of what you've already talked about. And you were on a show where you talked about it's not just about planting trees willy-nilly. There's actually a way in which you can plant them in terms of the pattern that helps with preventing pollution, that if you just kind of plant trees without considering that the pollution can kind of go up and over a tree and make it worse. I would love if you can talk a little bit more about tree plantings in general. One, from that perspective, like there is a way in which we're supposed to do it. The other is like, how can people get involved with tree plantings? Because everybody has asked, well, what do I do? Do I water the plants outside? Am I supposed to take the trash out? So I think just to kind of ground this into reality of what you've done and also how it works would be great.
Yeah. So in terms of, how to plant in terms of a layout or, what to plant where, there's this notion that we use that, again, there's just not much evidence for, but we're trying to really figure out. But we know what we call context matters, place-based context. So I just mentioned like a roadside environment. That's one place where it's especially important because the majority of pollutions in cities comes from vehicle exhausts. A lot of the roadways take up a lot of space. They absorb a lot of heat. They generate a lot of noise. So, first of all, what you plant near a road might be a lot different than what you want to plant in a park or at a school, right? And like you mentioned, the layout in which we've planted near roads, we've paid really close attention to, because when you have a layout where air can sort of get into a dense planting near roads, and it causes the air to swirl around again and again and again. And when it swirls around, that allows much more opportunity for pollutants in that air to make contact with the leaves. And if they're the right leaves, if there's a lot of surface area and they're waxy leaves, the pollution is more likely to stick to those leaves, right? So as the air swirls around, the pollutants coming from those tailpipes can stick to the leaves or the needles or the stems and what have you. And then, because it's swirling around, it eventually exits, and it exits cleaner, and it goes into communities, and it goes into homes, and it goes into people's lungs, right? So that air that's made this contact is going to be cleaner, and it's going to be healthier. And it's the same thing with noise. The layout that you plant trees, the noise reflects in different ways, and you can plant trees in different layouts so that they can better reduce noise, because too much noise can harm health. It's the same thing with heat, right? If you're in a place that's subject to, really extreme heat island effect, and really extreme summer temperatures and heat waves that are harming health, tree planting to facilitate airflows can be very important. And I know, we all want shade. We all want to stand in the shade, and shade is great, right? But if you are creating shade at the expense of airflow, there's planting techniques where you can kind of maximize both. But if you're not paying close attention, there's a lot of ways that, maybe you're getting benefits from trees, but you're getting far from the greatest benefits of trees.
Who's responsible for making or for understanding that? Is that you? And then how to actually set up the types of trees and where they go?
From a scientific perspective, in many ways, it is me. Um, in terms of the ways trees affect health, there are dozens of different ways trees affect health. So scientists like me are trying to figure out, I guess, what is the total impact of all of these ways, but also, how does this way affect health, and how does, the layout of planting this way, affect this part of health that ultimately affects health, and just figure out each of those pathways and the context, the place-based context to which they're relevant, because it's only with that full profile that we can really optimize the benefits of trees. Now, when it comes to actually planting, planting in cities or creating planting policy, there's a lot of organizations. There's U.S. Forest Service, there's a Nature Conservancy, American Forest, Arbor Day Foundation, on and on and on, and then local organizations too. But in a lot of cases, there's just not the science to support, the details of what they do. And that's what, myself and environmental scientists and, parks and recreation scientists and noise scientists, air pollution scientists, there's all these effects of trees. So it requires just an enormous multidisciplinary scientific effort to kind of pull all of this apart and figure out what's actually going on and what we can do about it.
But you have some good time series data now to show that over time these things work, right?
We are working on it. It isn't published yet, but we have preliminary results that are showing that, the planting is lowering levels of inflammation, which is a major contributor to many different kinds of disease. We're looking at things like cholesterol and immune system function, and sort of figuring out, these impacts of the planting. It'll be a while before, because, there's only so many hundreds of participants before we can, identify effects on things like heart attacks and strokes and that sort of thing. But the main thing is to sort of look at things like, immune system function, inflammation, all of these risk factors for the outcomes. Because if you have the risk factors, you're pretty much guaranteed to be better or worse off, for the outcomes. So we're kind of looking at all these different risk factors, and then sort of backtracking and figuring out, okay, if we see a difference in inflammation or we see a difference in immune function, why is that? Is it because the effects of heat are blunted? Is it because the effects of pollution are blunted? Is that because there's more biodiversity in the neighborhood and promotes the microbiome of people around it? And we're trying to figure out exactly why that is. And chances are it's all of those things and way more. But we're trying to figure out what's driving those things, what's really most important. Because once we figure that out, we can figure out approaches to planting to focus on what's most important to health.
So if I'm in, say, here in Washington, D.C., and I want to get involved with planting trees and being part of my community, do I just sign up with a local organization and then they assign me where I'm supposed to go? And is that basically it? Or is there a way that people can maintain trees on their own apart from what I do, which is picking up the litter from the trees? What else can kind of just everybody pay attention to help you and others who are studying the impact of trees on human health?
Well, from the standpoint of getting more and healthier trees in cities, just like you mentioned, there's usually volunteer groups in pretty much every major city that can plant trees, maintain trees. And then there's also opportunities, if you own any property to get, what are effectively, very, very cheap trees. I can get online now and order a tree from the Arbor Day Foundation delivered to my door for less than $20, right? And, plant that tree, keep an eye on it, do everything I can to help it grow. And like you mentioned, clean up after it too, make sure that tree is well maintained. Or if you, have trees around you that are really large established trees, just like humans, trees have a health status and there's things you can do to improve the health of trees. And honestly, just like humans, cities are not a super healthy place for trees to be. There's a lot of health benefits don't get me wrong, there's a lot of health benefits of cities for humans. But there's also things that, aren't that healthy. And people kind of overlook that for trees, well, maybe there's not as many benefits as there are for humans, but there are also a lot of challenges, especially with the soil, with pollution, with runoff and getting enough water, with getting enough nutrients, that sort of thing. So keeping those trees healthy, doing what you can to maintain them, the area around them, if they're dropping leaves, figure out what, maybe you can compost those leaves or, find ways to sort of mulch that into soil nutrients and kind of just keep the entire ecosystem healthy because these are challenging environments for trees.
I started working with trees about 4 years ago. We started doing films on forest health protection for the Forest Service. And I'll never forget the first time I actually saw a tree. Do you know what I mean? Like, I saw the tree. And so we developed this whole series of films about not just seeing them, but noticing them and then taking care of them. So when I talk to people about my work, inevitably people will come back and say, Stacy, for the first time, I actually noticed the trees when I was driving home tonight. And now I can't not see them. And so we're always trying to help people just see the trees outside their window, along their walk, wherever they are, thinking back in their childhood about that special tree that kind of holds this special moment for them. But it is true. I think first we have to have people understand that they are there. Because, I know personally, walking down the street, how many times I never noticed my environment. And I think that fundamentally changes people once they kind of open their eyes. And then the second part is, how do they impact us? We know, even without data, that we feel calm when we're in nature. There have been multiple studies around the world showing that for many years. So that's really hopeful. And I think with you, what I see and what I've heard from you is like you there's a sense of joy that I get from you about your work. So what makes you joyful about this work, and what would you share with others to give them hope about the future of nature and how they can positively help ensure that we have a healthy world for everyone?
Yeah, what makes me joyful is the potential of this work. You can drive through cities around the world and see potential of places to plant trees or see potential of ways that urban forests can be better designed to improve health. And to me, there's just so much that's not known. There's way, way more that's not known about how trees interact and influence with humans than is known. And by learning all of that, it's a very exciting prospect because there's just so much that we can do with that information. And there's so much to kind of learn about the trees and learn things that can improve health, but also to learn about ourselves, right? Because we're just, inherently evolved to be around trees. And we're used to, their microbiota, we're used to seeing them, our basic physiology, our basic mental wiring is meant to be around trees. It's just a fact. And understanding, why that is and how it happens and what you can do about it. There's so much potential there. And it's just, to me, exciting, all of that potential. Like you said, when you really, the first time you saw a tree, when you pay attention to a tree, when you're walking through a neighborhood, that's not an accident. They're infinitely complex, and, the basic wiring of your brain and body is meant to be around those trees. And when you kind of get separated from those environments, things start to go wrong. You might not realize it, you might not perceive it, and you might not, have anything to do about it. But when you're there and, there is more nature around you, I think you can kind of feel more what the human experience really is, in its natural environment versus kind of the default state of most people in the world, which is being separated from that natural environment.
And we have words. We say, oh, I feel rooted to this place, or I feel grounded. So these words come. We know that we are already connected to the earth. And it is true. Like for me personally, being disconnected and then reconnecting profoundly changed me. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like I'm going around hugging the trees, but there is a reverence and a continued acknowledgement on a daily basis of these incredible plants and trees. And I do believe now that the way we interact with them, and this sounds a little weird, but they react to us just as much as we react to them. I just don't think that we know at all anything about that yet. But it's an exciting, for me, awakening to realize that nature is not just around me, but it's almost like it's taking care of us.
Yeah, yeah. There's many scientists out there who study symbiotic relationships between, plants and animals. And, maybe not as much when it comes to symbiotic relationships between humans and plants. But, suffice to say is that there's incredible evidence out there that, that's a thing. And there's no reason to expect that it's not a thing with humans.
I mean, there has to, I mean, I always call them silent witnesses, right? They've been here throughout time. And, I think about that childhood tree out my window that saw me at my best and saw me at my worst and kind of just was there. And I always think, what if that tree could talk? What would it say about me as a person? And I recently went back to my childhood home, and here was this tree, old, disfigured, but still there. And it just made all those memories of my entire life just flooded back into my brain. And I really think that, like you said, when we disconnect, things don't go so right. But when we reconnect, and we all can, things can go really well. So how do you have a story about trees that you'd like to share? Not your favorite tree, but just a story or a quote or a saying or something that you would like to tell the people listening today, not just in Louisville, not just in Kentucky, not just in the States, but throughout the world. Something that's really special to you, not just about your work, but about trees.
Well, Stacey, I mean, that's a hard question for me to answer. I don't know if there's any one story, but to me, it's just, I mean, an infinite number of stories, right? I can drive around, my city or other cities and go to places and I can see, a group of trees, I can see a tree and think, you know, have I seen that before? How has it changed? How is it affecting the environment around it? How is it affecting me? If it's a tree in my front yard, you can just watch it grow over time. Or if it's a tree I might see, once a year at a place I visit once a year, how has that changed over time? And how has a group of trees, changed a landscape? How has the weather changed the trees? How has the landscape changed the trees? And just it's really incredible to me that it's a constantly dynamic environment. When we build a building, okay, you've got that building, maybe it'll get a little dirty, maybe it'll change a little bit over time, but the way trees just change through a season is immense. And it's just sort of that dynamic environment that you just don't get in non-natural environments. And it's just in so many ways. And that's just something that I feel like I notice on a regular basis. And, when I think about places where I was in my childhood, when I go back, okay, maybe the building is there as it always has been, but what's changed are all the plants around it.
So now imagine it's the end of your career. You're retired, you're no longer working, or maybe you're doing something else, but you have one message. You want to share it with your nephew, your children, someone. What would you say?
Well, at the end of my career, I would hope that I have something to show for all the work that I've put in figuring out these relationships. And, I just like to say that, there's always going to be challenges, but there's always going to be solutions. And, where I sit right now and where I am at the end of my career, that's always going to be true. And just sort of imparting that sort of, vision for not, how we are affected by challenges, but for how we respond to them, and why we respond to them that way. And, hopefully at the end of my career, I can give many examples that I can pass along and say, hey, maybe this was a bad situation, or maybe no one recognized this, or no one, had the vision for something that you did. But here is how you can address that. And maybe you will be successful, maybe you won't. But there's a certain value, and like you mentioned, a certain joy in just trying and just taking on a challenge and trying to benefit the world around you.
That's beautiful. And where would you tell people to go now to find more information about what you do, about if they want to study health geography, or just in general, where would you send people who are inspired by what they heard today?
Ooh, well, I mean, the obvious answer is just start Googling around, right? So there's a great group called the American Association of Geographers that gives a lot of information about geography. But you can also just sort of, look around on what people are doing. You can go to Google Scholar and you can look up, research papers and see what's out there. You can just sort of look at who is practicing different environmental fields around you. Who are the groups that are planting trees? Who are the groups that are doing urban planning or sustainability work? And just, if you're really interested in it, find out as much as you can, and also don't be afraid to reach out to people. I think, you'll find that if you find something that you're really passionate about, if you reach out to other people who are passionate about that and might be, already doing it, that they're likely to recognize that and be just happy to tell you more and listen to what you're interested in and give you some advice.
That's wonderful. It's what I always tell younger people. Don't be afraid to reach out to the people you admire or who inspire you, because generally people like to talk about what they do. So, well, thank you,
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Yeager. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for your words of inspiration and hope. I'd love to hear more down the line about the Green Heart Project and what you find. And I hope that you can return and speak with us again.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is great. Thanks so much.
And so, thank you very much. This is Stacy Whittle from the Stories of Trees. This podcast is a Corazon Latino project in conjunction with the USDA Forest Service. Thank you for joining us for Stories of Trees, brought to you by Corazon Latino. Before you go, we have a simple ask. See them. Notice them. Care for them. Until next time, stay connected to the trees around you and stay tuned for our next episode. This podcast was supported by the Urban and Community Forestry Program at the USDA Forest Service.